So I am Sarah Fletcher. I'm the head at St Paul's Girls' School, and I'm very excited to have been part of the organising team for this conference because all of us feel very strongly that it's time we started talking about education and time we started talking about the future. Everybody tells me it'll take at least 10 years to reform education, if that indeed is what we want to do, by which stage we'll be halfway through the 21st century and possibly even, if we're not careful, cruising towards the 22nd. So it's time to talk, most importantly. But really, really beautiful is our first keynote speaker, Andy Haldane, and in a minute I'll ask him to come to the stage. Andy I first knew when he was chief economist at the Bank of England. In 2014 he was nominated by Time magazine as one of the world's 100 most influential people. And Andy's career spans the type of people that we've brought together for this conference, from industry through university to education to levelling up agenda. So Andy himself in 2021 was asked to chair the Levelling Up Task Force by the government, and he is now co-chair of the City of London Social Mobility Task Force. Andy leads numerous charities. He is involved in volunteering work. He's published numerous articles, at least 200, and published 4 books. Andy is the visiting professor at several universities. He's quite an extraordinary figure, and most recently, of course, he is Chief Executive of the Royal Society for Arts. Now, the Royal Society for Arts has produced a new mission statement, which is called Design for Life. It poses a number of questions, 3 in all, and it's the first one that appeals most to me. And it says, what if all children from their early years were given chances to nurture their creativity and build a greater connection to the natural world? The overarching mission of the RSA is to create a more resilient, rebalanced, and regenerative future. I can't think of a better connection to our conference. Andy, I'd like to invite you to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Lovely words. Overly generous. Morning, everyone. Fantastic to see you all here. And Happy New Year, if it's not too late to be saying that. Certainly not too late to be happy anyway, despite it being January and cold. Great to be here speaking at this conference, Edge Foundation conference, on next generation assessment. Sarah mentioned, this is actually my first time in the Drapers Hall. Magnificent building, despite having spent fully 32 years of my professional career within a stone's throw of here, actually, at the Bank of England. So great to be here and great to be with you. The backdrop, nonetheless, is pretty sobering, is it not? Not for nothing was last year's word of the year polycrisis. You can see why. Lots went wrong, did it not? From the war in Ukraine to the cost of living crisis, from the climate emergency to the instabilities in our healthcare system that we hear about on a daily basis. The world is simply full of anxieties and fragilities right now in its key economic and social and environmental systems. And while clearly there's no singular, much less simple solution to all of those problems, anxieties, and instabilities, it strikes me without question that issues of education, issues of learning must be at the front and center of any lasting and long-term solution to those problems, to that polycrisis. As the education thinker and writer Zachary Stein said almost exactly a year ago, education is the root of all the more specific crises, such as climate change, governance breakdowns, impending war, and social unrest. All that's your fault, by the way. The good news is redemption also lies in our collective hands when it comes to rethinking and refashioning how we think about education and learning. The stakes could scarcely be higher, could they? And that really serves to underscore the importance of events like this, which, of course, are about not just rethinking, but very much reshaping how we conceive of the educational landscape as a conduit and as a catalyst for that reshaping of the social systems in the 21st century I've mentioned was so important. So nothing less is needed than that wholesale reform, I think, if we are to prevent polycrisis not just being the word of last year, but the word of this year and several years to come as well. Now, this is the point where I put my glasses on, because I've reached the stage in life where I need both contact lenses and glasses to navigate through a lecture. Now, this is territory, fortunately, in which the RSA, Royal Society of Arts, where I now have the pleasure and honour to be Chief Executive, has a pretty rich history dating back now, getting on for 270 years. In each case, the role we've played is to seek to rise to the societal challenge of the day and to put in place educational practices that are next practice, as distinct from best practice. And by doing that, I hope the role we've played has opened up opportunities for many thousands, if not millions, of people over the time we've been in play. That includes catalysing educational institutions such as the Royal Academies of Art and Music. It speaks to our role in developing the world's first ever programme of open credit-carrying examinations in the mid-19th century. It manifests in our student design awards, now almost a century old, and indeed our pupil design awards, now still a youngster at only a decade old. It speaks to our role in setting up the RSA Examination Board 150 years ago. Its modern incarnation is OCR, and to the RSA Academies that we ran from earlier this century. But if that's the past, and indeed some of the present, what then of the future? And I think a useful starting point there, not just for my talk, but for this whole conference, is to think a little bit about those structural, those secular forces within society likely to shape not only our educational model, but indeed all of those social systems that we rely on for our success. And from what is inevitably a long list of forcing factors, of secular trends, let me speak briefly about three of those. Three often seen as the horsemen of the apocalypse: technology, demography, and inequality. What I want to argue is that it's true to say each and every one of those is indeed a near-term challenge. But as with all near-term challenges, they also throw up some significant medium-term opportunities when it comes to rethinking and refashioning learning and education. So starting then with technology, much of this will be familiar to most of you. I mean, the challenge technology poses is pretty well understood now. I think it will most likely, on most estimates, lead to a pretty massive skills transition in the years ahead, of a scale at least equivalent to that which we saw during the prior three industrial revolutions of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. The fourth industrial revolution of the 21st century will be at least as great in its skills transition. We're talking about perhaps between a half and three-quarters of all jobs undergoing some significant change in their composition, over the next few decades. And just as important as the changes in jobs will be the changes in the skills needed to carry out those jobs, if indeed we are to escape the clutches of the machine, and if AI displacement is to be avoided. Again, most studies of the future work landscape suggest this technological transition will increase pretty materially the demand not only for those higher end technical and academic skills, but also, crucially, sets of vocational and interpersonal skills as well. They will come at an even greater premium because it's harder to replicate those through machine or through AI. In the face of this pretty searing jobs and skills transition, however, we shouldn't overlook, as I know you wouldn't, the simply vast opportunities I think these new technologies usher in educationally, not least through digital and AI technologies. Thus far in human history, in fact, the constraints on education and learning have been hard physical constraints: numbers of teachers, numbers of schools. And while technology does not remove those constraints, it plainly lessens them to some significant degree, and will to an increasing extent in the period ahead. As an example of that, AI means that a completely personalized learning journey, fine-tuned to our individual learning styles and indeed neurologies, is now well within our technological grasp. And as I'll come on to, I think that is potentially transformative for how we teach and how we learn, and can unlock the potential of many people currently lost from the educational net. If I turned from technology to demography, the trends are no less searing. As you all will know, people born today have a decent chance of living 100-year lives, and as the corollary of that, may well be having 70 or perhaps even 80-year careers. And if you take that alongside those technology-driven shifts in skills and jobs I mentioned, the implication is that many people in future generations will need to undergo multiple transitions, not just of jobs, but of careers. And we know, don't we, from painful experience, that making those transitions can be tougher the older we are. Old dogs, new tricks, and all that. But it isn't all downside, obviously. The opportunity opened up by us having 70 or 80-year multiple careers is huge. That will put an even greater premium than ever previously in human history on us making a practical reality of lifelong learning, rather than just banging on about it in rhetorical terms, as we have now for several decades. And if we do that, that for me would open up huge potential to expand the workforce, to draw upon the people, the experience and expertise of those in the final stages of their career, to allow their skills to be renewed and refreshed, to enable them to remain in the workforce, and thereby to boost their wealth and well-being. That's a pretty big prize. And then thirdly and finally, the third horseman was inequality. Now, you all know much better than me the evidence here, which could not be clearer, on the way in which educational differences, seeded from the earliest of years, indeed possibly in uterus, then grow over the course of a lifespan, and among the adverse consequences of that are not just high and rising educational inequality, but the manifestation of that in life outcomes, whether that's incomes or well-being. And that means that, among other things, that those most in need of lifelong learning, because they leave the system underskilled, are presently those least likely to engage in such learning. These people leave school sometimes loathing, not loving learning, which is about the worst endowment educationally we could ever wish on anyone. And once lifelong learning moves from rhetoric to reality, it becomes a necessity, in fact. The costs felt by those lost learners will be even greater than they have been in the past. Now, some at least, I think, of this inequality in educational opportunity and outcomes arises, in my view, not from any innate differences in ability or aptitude or intelligence, whatever that means, but instead from the particular educational model that has been standard issue for several centuries, if you like, the chalk and talk model. Now that model almost certainly worked fantastically well for everyone in this room. That's why we're all in this room, among the reasons. But we know also from lots of research now that that model often doesn't work for many other people equally able, but whose learning style is somewhat different. Recent research from the RSA, backing up plenty of other research, points strongly in that direction. The individual styles or personas of different people, the cues and motivations and techniques needed to nurture a love of learning are often very different. And that is why, for many of those people, that standard model of learning can generate fear and loathing about learning, not lifelong love. Now, the opportunity I think this presents is that if in future we were able to personalize learning to individual learning styles and neurologies, then we should be able to unlock the potential in many more people otherwise lost, generate that rich endowment, that love of learning that is the ultimate educational endowment. That now strikes me as well within our grasp and therefore within our gift, and will be one means of closing those high and those rising inequalities in educational opportunity and outcome, indeed in income and well-being. Hard to think of a bigger societal prize than that one. So against that backdrop then, what can we say about the sort of education model we need to avoid the pitfalls and indeed maximize the opportunities presented by that combination of technology, demography, and inequality in the 21st century? I think the one thing we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence, can we not, is that that model is very unlikely to be an identicate of the model that's actually served us brilliantly for the past century or more, a model of priming young people with academic skills using big blocks of physically delivered examination-based learning. It strikes me that both what and how we learn will need to undergo a fairly significant overhaul if we are to surf those technological, demographic, and inequality waves I've just touched upon. And far be it from me to be at all prescriptive about that model. That's not my role, it's not my expertise, that's one of the roles of this conference. Let me nonetheless just sketch some of the contours of how that model might look. It will, I suspect, mean seeking to nurture, recognize, and reward what are currently often invisible capabilities or attributes as distinct from skills that we know to be essential to but also transferable across the future world of work. So that includes, of course, creativity and innovation and resilience and problem solving and communication and negotiation and empathy and tolerance, from what is doubtless a longer list. It would mean, most likely, developing those skills in overtly team-based rather than individual settings, using experiential rather than examination-based techniques. It would, of course, mean modular, indeed granular, learning rather than in big blocks, which means fusing together someone's work journey and learning journey, which brings to the point about employers being here today and a key part of the learning journey. It would mean, I think, devising and executing genuinely personalized learning journeys, tech-enabled, but without forgetting the human, with AI attuning those journeys to individual learning styles and circumstances, often, but not always, digitally delivered. It would mean recognizing those lifelong learner journeys in digital learner logs and recognizing and rewarding them through digital badges. All that stuff very much in the spirit of the recommendations from last year's Times Education Commission. I know Rachel Sylvester is here and talking later on today. Now, I recognize, as of course do you, that each of those measures individually is a pretty significant step, and put them end to end, that's a pretty giant leap. That's a genuine system shift, the like of which we may not have seen perhaps for a century or more. But the important thing is to get started, I think, on that long journey. I think some of that is starting today. Ollie was telling me in the breakout sessions. And I hope as part of that, my new gig at the RSA, that we can help play a supportive role, as well as reimagining this 21st century model of learning. We are keen to make some practical steps, to put in place some purposive interventions that can allow us to take those first steps along the road. As Sarah kindly mentioned, we launched last year our so-called Design for Life program. That was the concept car. This year we are road testing that car. At its heart, the mission is about the regeneration game. We're in the regeneration game for the 3 Ps, that is to say, people, place, and planet. That's tackling the polycrisis, plural, polycrises, affecting our economic, social, environmental systems. And that agenda, that regeneration game, applies with particular zeal for me when it comes to regenerating people, their learning, and the accompanying educational system. For example, we're in the early stages of developing what I hope is a next generation capabilities framework that better matches what we think will be needed among all of us to make a success of this century. My only cultural reference point these days is British Bake Off. So I think about this as a 3-layer cake, the base layer of which are those foundational skills, literacy, numeracy, digital literacy. Then you've got the jam and cream in the middle, which are the non-transferable vocational and academic skills. And then on top, the top layer, which is often the absent layer, is the transferable capabilities and attributes I mentioned earlier on, from creativity to empathy, often invisible, often underinvested in, and often absent from the way we think about people's learner journey. We're developing some sequenced pathways of learning in the form of a Design for Life awards scheme that is modular, that is team-based, that is experiential, that is creativity, and capability building to nurture and grow, to recognize and reward those often invisible skills shaping not just our livelihoods but our lives. Augmenting that work, we're building out a new RSA education network. We have an ambitious embryonic program in primary schools and early years to nurture creativity by connecting early years children with nature and with their communities. And if any of those sound at all enticing, we would love to discuss those with you, indeed to partner with you on them. And finally, that Design for Life program segues seamlessly with the work of the Edge Foundation and others besides, including around building a future British baccalaureate, and indeed with the Camino Foundation. I know Bill is here, on a universal digital learner log. Now, I'm overexcited about all this stuff. And I hope with good reason, because the potential for this to unlock even more potential in people and in places, levelling up, I think could not be larger. This is the key means, for me, by which we can slay that many-headed monster that is the polycrisis that I mentioned at the beginning, and help remove it from our lexicon on an enduring basis. And very much look forward both to hearing your thoughts today, during the day, but also after today, working with you on making that a practical reality. On that, let me stop and thank you all for listening.
Out of time now for questions, so I'll invite Beatrice to be our next keynote speaker, but thank you enormously for that extraordinary insight into the work of the RSA and wonderful vision, inspiring vision for what education could and should be doing for the future generations. Thank you very much, Andy. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Beatrice Pont, who has appeared on screen. Beatrice, I'm probably speaking in the wrong way for seeing you, but I'm so pleased that you're able to join us here today. Beatrice brings enormous research ability and capacity and knowledge, but also, and most importantly, practical experience in implementing educational change in different countries. She currently works for the UNESCO as Global Training Practice Lead, where she leads and coordinates educational training programs across the globe. Previously, she worked for UNESCO and for the OECD, and what she was doing was working in the Directorate for Education and Skills, advising on the development of educational policy in countries like Sweden and Norway and Wales and Japan and Mexico, right the way across the globe. Her experience, therefore, of implementing the kind of change that we are talking about is extraordinary. And I'll quote from one of her most recent tweets, where she was observing that it is all very well and good to demonstrate that certain educational change is necessary, but unless you have a roadmap for implementation, then that will go nowhere. So Beatrice, I'm delighted to welcome you to our conference and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me, though, from afar, in a very beautiful room from what I see, full of beautiful pictures. And I wish I was there, but this is the closest I can get at this point. To you, international trends in student assessments and how to think about planning for the future. So my presentation is going to focus on Okay, now I have why change, the changing context of education that we've already heard about, student assessments, and then leading change in a VUCA world, lessons from our experience at present. And as I was introduced, my background is now at UNESCO International Institute for Education Planning. And before I had been at the OECD Education Directorate for more than 22 years. So where I've been practicing and doing research on leadership and education change. So what we've seen is a changing context in education that is really influencing all of our education policy, planning, and management. And what we're seeing is a changing context where we're moving from knowledge to developing competencies and values, and that is what is being required outside. And so this requires us to think about new revised curricula, different approaches to pedagogy, different approaches to assessment. And this is really, we're in the midst of this, and this is what we're seeing internationally. But the external context is extremely important and has a huge influence on the work of education policy and practice in schools. The environment, it's pushing us to define ways to lead change in times of uncertainty. As you've lived through COVID and other issues that we are living through in the countries that I work with in Africa, for example, with floods and other, drying of schools being closed. So this requires us to be very flexible and to move forward in times of uncertainty and having always a plan B. Technology is also pushing us to change in the way we deliver teaching and learning. And diversity and globalization is also asking us to change how we teach, because we have a very diverse group of students in our schools, in our education systems internationally. And so this requires different approach, classroom practices and assessments approaches. In terms of governance, we've also moved from, in the past, very top-down education systems, very top-down policymaking, to a world of complexity where there are so many stakeholders involved in defining policy, in moving towards implementing policy, and many more people who have a stake. And therefore, we need to recognize this and understand how to deliver policy and change with so many more stakeholders. And in terms of outcomes, it's no longer about paper, about numbers, but it's actually about practice. What do students, what can they do? And what do we do, to make change happen? We need to invest in implementation as it is key to know that there will be an outcome to what we defined. And the accountability as well has changed, and it's evolving, and student assessments are part of this, but it's more about moving from quantity to impact. What is this leading to? So there is a huge move towards and more data, and all of this influences what we do in education. So one of the key changes that we are living through in many education systems is the transformation of curriculum, and we're moving beyond only knowledge to also integrating skills, attitudes, values, and all of this in competency framework. So it's no longer about what we know, but what we do with what we know, how we integrate it. And this requires a change in pedagogy and a change in assessment as well. And this is a figure from the OECD that shows how these types of skills are being integrated in different curricula in math and humanities, science, whether critical thinking, problem solving, cooperation, respect, empathy, learning to learn, and all of these skills and attitudes are integrated or not across our curricula. And this is a shift in many, many countries. Now, this shift started before COVID, but we've seen actually that many countries have changed their curricula because of COVID. So here's some comparative data on how in 2019 to 20 and 2021, actually many countries made adjustments to the curriculum. And so in the past, it seemed so difficult to make change happen. And this has really shown us that actually, when the time comes, when systems are capable of changing very quickly while learning through it. So many countries extended, or some countries extended the academic year, others prioritize certain areas of the ones delegated, and other adjustments in student assessments as well, which is the core of the event, are extremely related to curricula. And on the left, you see evaluation and assessment framework. Curricula we see at the center, and education system evaluation, school evaluation, appraisals, and all of these practices influence as well. But what is important is student assessment, the purpose of it. So why does it exist? Why do we have it across all education systems? Well, it helps focus the attention on the learning progress and outcomes of each student. Teachers need assessment information to target their current and future teaching and improve their classroom instruction. And actually, when you renew a curriculum, you need to think about how to assess the content of what you're assessing and how you are assessing, so that there is alignment between the changes in the curricular goals, the content, the materials, and the pedagogies. And actually, what we've seen in many education systems is that what you measure in the end is what is being taught, and ultimately what students learn. And so I work, for example, with one particular country where, at the end of secondary, there's such a high stakes test that students hardly go to school. They are going to after school academies to prepare themselves to pass this high stake assessment, which is not linked to schooling actually. So for the whole last year, teachers are leaving the education system to teach their own students in academies to prepare them for the tests. So it's very disassociated with learning. And so there is a need to change in this new environment. Now, we've seen that it was possible, and student assessments during COVID, they were changed. Some systems maintained exams, others canceled them, others postponed. But what is interesting is those that modified the exams, using alternative ways for validating learning, either reducing the content, changing the mode of administration. And here you see internationally how systems did it, whether they, in Africa, many postponed the exams. On the left, you see whether it was the countries and the policies, and the right is the same, but according to the proportion of students. So in Africa, many rescheduled or postponed the exams or maintained it, but in other countries, the orange, but the yellow is modified the exam or modified the approach. And you see that, in Arab states and Asia and the Pacific, especially in Europe and American, the Caribbean and global, at least 25% of the student assessments were modified. And in those that they introduced alternative assessments, so at least 22% of the countries used the content of the exam, or they did other modification, or administered the exam online. So there is, if you want more data on what countries did internationally, I've put some sources there, but I think the idea is that student assessment can change, and we've changed it very quickly in many different systems. And it's worked, it hasn't worked, but we've piloted it already, and we've seen that it can happen. Now, what we know is that it's important to clarify what is the purpose and uses of these exams. And sometimes we see systems that just pile up so many purposes to these exams. They are for entry into tertiary, for diagnosing the whole system, for diagnosing individuals, for helping schools perform, to evaluate school performance. Even we've seen it to evaluate teacher performance. So we see that there many systems pile up many purposes onto one exam. And I think that's quite, we've seen that that's very delicate, that needs to be reflected on quite in depth. Now, also the format of the assessment, and I think this is something for you to discuss. When you change knowledge skill towards a competency-based curriculum that includes knowledge, skills, and competencies, do only written exams fit this purpose? Do you have to have additional types of oral exams, practice-based exams? Do you have to base yourself in some other kinds of practices? And this is where we are, and especially with technology, the capacity is immense to change the way we assess students, to accept, a new demography who are, living with technology since they're born, who are different cohorts that we need to recognize. So we see that, and here's just a paper we did when I was at the OECD, when we were comparing how different relevant education systems were assessing students at the end of secondary. And you see, for example, the IB, the International Baccalaureate, that does written, oral, practical, and project-based assessments, and that also school-based assessments have taken, and this has happened also with COVID in many systems. So there is a variety of approaches, but we've seen that historically education systems hold on to their national exams for 80 years, 90 years, and continue to want to focus on the same exam for very different types of students and very different type of learning, teaching and learning. So that holding on, and we've seen, for example, in Ireland, where it was so difficult to change the national exams, that when COVID came, they thought, well, should we actually vaccine first the students who will take the national exams versus people who are older and who need to be protected? Because they were trying to preserve the national exam, which in the end they changed actually. And now they're in a process of reflection on how to change. So all this change, it's necessary, and it's because we need to adapt to the new world, to the trends that are facing our education systems, our students, and ourselves. Now, at UNESCO, I wanted to talk a little bit about our own case. At UNESCO, at the heart of IIEP, this institute that I'm working in, we develop capacity for education policy and planning professionals. And they are mostly in Africa and Asia, Latin America, those people who are in ministries of education, departments of education, designing and shaping systems, education systems performance. And so at the heart of what we do, there's a lot of training for planning, finance, data, and governance, and management for improved learning, for equity, and for lifelong learning. Now, I lead the training programs here at IIEP, and we train these professionals who are developing and planning their education systems. And we've trained more than 30,000 participants since we started 60 years ago. And at the heart is practice. It's very practice-based, and we aim for them to learn how to use planning effectively to design and implement education system change. And we see that most point to the confidence to do without help as a result of our training. But what I wanted to say is that we are also in a moment of change based on all of these factors that are influencing us. So last year, we trained more than 1,700 people, and most of our courses really prepare education policy planners how to use data for planning education systems. So student assessments may be at the core of education monitoring and information systems. And one of the issues is how to use student assessments as a thermometer to measure the performance of an education system, how to develop them, and how to use them. But because of all these changes, we also need to change the way we teach and the way that our learners learn. So of shaping a new training structure. We're going to develop, do face-to-face, hybrid, and online learning, which we're already doing now, but we will have a modular curriculum that delivers credits and diplomas, a very particular teaching and learning approach that is practitioner-based, and data, monitoring and evaluation to make sure that we assess our learning and use it to understand how we can improve. And the key enablers are our IT infrastructure, resources, and capacity. But this is just an introduction on, well, for our learners, assessment is at the heart of our change. And so we're developing a new handbook in a way on the design of our courses using the learning design principle. And at the heart is, how do we teach? What are the practices that we use for teaching? And how do we assess our learners? And I think using a combination of formative, summative assessment, but especially practice-oriented, and finding new ways of assessing that are meaningful, that are authentic for the learners. And I think that's at the heart of where we are now ourselves exploring how to use assessment. So to end with, I think what's important is, that this process of changing assessments is very, very embedded in societies, embedded in the cultures that we live in. And so changing them requires a huge effort that is very looking for consistency. It needs alignment. And so it needs to have a vision. Why are we changing the assessment? Is it aligned to the curriculum? And why do we want a new assessment? Then how are we going to assess? What are the approaches? We have to find the right approaches to assessment. How will we fund this? But this needs to be embedded with inclusive stakeholder engagement. And that is involving people like you. Many of you are here from academies, principals from different schools, from local governments, I've seen the participant list. It's amazing, the richness that you've brought into the room. So I think engaging in the process of shaping assessments is very important, so that you actually believe in them in the future. If you're not involved, if you don't shape the future, then the chances that this change will happen is very low, actually. So it's quite important that you are involved and throughout the whole process. But also what's important is that the context is conducive, and that is that there is alignment, as I said, with the curriculum, but with evaluation as well, and that there is capacity to deliver. If you change ways of assessing, who will assess? Will it be teachers? Will it be external organizations? Will it be technology with artificial intelligence, as we're seeing now, this in the last month, how students actually, bots, artificial intelligence are writing essays. Can they also assess essays? So what are the how to assess, and then who will be using that data? And all of this needs to be thought in a coherent way if you need to move forward. So I will stop here, and I just wanted to contribute with some thoughts for you to discuss throughout your next sessions, and give you some comparative perspectives that you can use in the next step. So thank you very much.
Beatrice, I'm so grateful to you for setting out such an extraordinary wealth of experience for us, and for talking to us about the importance of implementation and of alignment in our thinking right the way across the piece in education. And that indeed is from Key Stage 1 right the way through to university and beyond, to adult education and lifelong learning. But thank you very much, Beatrice, for your contribution. We're very, very grateful.